or on any of our other professional learning modules, we will provide our email address at the end. So, in today's session, feedback that fuels student learning in an online environment, we will look at how to develop mutually agreeable goals for feedback with students, help shift grades to be reflective of the learning process, and implement feedback strategies that are effective, timely, actionable, and ongoing in order to guide students to reach their potential. So feedback and teaching are one in the same. Providing feedback is a fundamental skill in the profession, and with fundamental skills, sometimes they become so routine that we may have forgotten the original characteristics and rules that laid the foundation for learning them. We need to remind ourselves of those foundational skills and then honestly reflect at how far we may have shifted from what we did when we originally learned those skills to what we do now. So let's quickly take a look at some feedback examples that you may have either received, heard, or even given in the past. What are your reactions to these examples? Great job on this outline. Next time, double check your grammar. This is incorrect. Try again and pay attention to your verb tenses. These may appear to be an oversimplified version of bad feedback, but they illustrate the three qualities that feedback is not. Feedback is not praise, advice, or bossy in tone. We receive feedback all the time in areas beyond the virtual classroom. Are you a gamer? Perhaps you know a gamer. What is it about games that drives players to keep playing to improve? Even if they reach a peak point of frustration, a heavy feeling of failure, eventually they pick back up and try again, determined to advance and to beat the game. One thing to consider, games provide real-time valuable feedback. If you fell off that tree, next time you know to jump sooner. If your player hit a home run, you now know the cue for that perfect pitch. Even in other types of games, such as football, softball, or basketball, players are provided real-time valuable feedback. And I'd just like to share with you kind of a personal experience of this very recently. So I have been learning to play chess over the last few weeks. Considering I'm very new at it, I haven't won a lot of games. But every time I play with my partner, I ask, what could I have done to potentially win that game? Or why was that move a bad move? And how can I improve the next time we play? And each time I receive that feedback, I put that strategy into place. So maybe moving my pawn 2 steps forward instead of 1 step forward next time, and seeing what happens when I then implement that strategy. And it's really helped me to improve, so much so that the last game we played, we drew. So I didn't lose, we drew. So I'm learning all that time, and getting that real-time feedback is absolutely crucial. So why is it that feedback on assignments often generates feeling of failure and frustration, but losing in games or throwing repeated free throws keeps students interested to persevere? Motivation can be intrinsic and extrinsic. Students need to be intrinsically motivated to persevere through the feedback process. So what are some ways we can foster motivation in our students? One way to foster motivation in students is to make sure that you and your students agree on the purpose of feedback. So to come to an agreement on the purpose, You first have to identify your goal and your student's goal for feedback. This is a process that will take some time to implement, so start small. Consider your conversations with your students at the start of the year and ask them and find out what they hope to get out of the feedback that you will provide. Be sure to talk about how you perceive feedback and then ask the student how he or she perceives it in order to work towards that agreement. Before you can have that conversation, you need to ask yourself, what is your goal for feedback? Let's take a moment, and think about your specific goal. If you want, pop it in the chat box. Yep, we've got checking understanding, expressing themselves clearly, knowing progress, learning from mistakes, learning in a friendly context. Thank you for all these comments, they're fantastic. So whilst we're thinking about what your goal for feedback would look like, let's have a look at this idea from John Hattie, a researcher in education. So the aim of feedback is to reduce the gap between where students are and where they should be. The teacher, therefore, needs to know what students bring to each lesson at the start and to articulate what success looks like. So reflect on what you think your goal would look like, and is it in line with Hattie's? If so, how? If not, what is different? So let's go even further. Have you considered the student perspective of feedback? What do you think your students would say is their goal of feedback? Most likely, students see feedback as the steps they need to take to get a better grade. However, when feedback is associated with a grade, that's where the feelings of failure and frustration can begin to build. So an idea to help with those emotions is to shift the student's perception of grades. When you provide feedback, do you offer a grade each time? Are you mindful of providing feedback that will help the student understand how to improve their work in order to get a better grade on a future assignment? Sometimes we edit, grade, and return assignments because it is unknown if the student will submit the assignment again. However, when we are able to shift a student's perception of grades, feedback becomes more meaningful. According to Mindshift, grades are supposed to be a recognition of the learning process a student went through, not the product a student strives for exclusively. But disentangling those things is a challenge, and it is made more difficult by the real consequences of good grades for kids' futures. So as educators, we may not be able to change the general opinion of grades, but we can provide students with grades that are reflective of their efforts where appropriate. So engage in conversations with your students on how they earned that final grade. When students receive a final grade with no explanation, they associate that grade with the product and then lose the feedback about their learning process. When meeting with students to determine a mutually agreeable goal for feedback, consider these two additional points. Make sure students understand that feedback is not the finish line. Rather, it is a pit stop on the course. And the ultimate goal is to have students fulfill their potential. Grades are a reflection of their efforts. Charlie, if you could please play the video. Thank you.
Now that we have an idea of possible goals for feedback from both teacher and student perspectives, let's look at the actual feedback you will provide. Just as there are characteristics of bad feedback to be aware of, there are specific characteristics of good feedback. Good feedback needs to be effective, but what does effective mean? What is effective for one person may be ineffective for another. For our purposes, we will use the dictionary definition that effective means something is successful in producing a desired or intended result. As we just discussed, the desired or intended result will be the agreed upon goal of your feedback that is developed by both you and your students. That goal will most likely be different depending on the student. For the goal of the feedback to be effective, both teacher and student need to agree on what the quality product will look like. Lastly, get to know your students to know what will motivate them to persevere and not give up. That relationship you develop with your students is of paramount importance, as that will guide you on when to push versus when to try a different strategy. Next, good feedback needs to be timely, both in when you provide the feedback and in the time you allow students to process it. When providing feedback, be mindful of your turnaround time. To keep the process moving forward, students need the feedback in a timely manner. The nature of the assignment will impact the timeliness of the feedback. Quick assignments should have a faster return than larger assignments, such as portfolios and research projects. Check with your school's administration, as oftentimes there are guidelines on the turnaround time teachers are expected to return assignments. Other important aspects of timeliness is the time you provide students to process your feedback. Planning a purposeful time with your students, whether a synchronous session, phone call, or conversation on text, provides students time to respond to the feedback. When you plan for that time for students to process feedback, you increase the chance of them having purposeful reflection rather than skimming it over and ignoring it. Teachers use their valuable time to generate meaningful feedback. Therefore, using instructional time with students to review it is equally as valuable. Speaking of time, it is a common worry about the time commitment of providing meaningful, relevant, timely, and effective feedback to all your students. Be mindful of common questions on which many students struggle, misunderstand, or miss a step, and then create a feedback bank in a word processing document. The bulk of your feedback can be copied from that bank and then personalized based on the individual student and your knowledge of what motivates that student to continue. Next, feedback needs to be actionable. Praise, advice, and bossiness are not actionable. This module started with some examples of bad feedback. Let's take a look again at those pieces of feedback with revisions to make them actionable. To help you determine if your feedback is actionable, read this quote from Education Week. While both praise and feedback are important elements, use this formula to see if your students are losing sight of the feedback in the mix of praise. Does the praise and feedback equal the student doing something with the feedback? The goal of feedback is for students to do something with it, to be productive, and move their learning forward. Without those next steps, it is possible that the feedback will be overlooked if paired with praise, and you may want to consider a way to separate them. Ongoing is the last characteristic we will examine. Encourage students to contact you for feedback before they are ready to submit an assignment. Feedback is not linear, meaning students do not have to submit something final to get feedback. As they are working, encourage them to send you questions via email or set up a time to talk with you directly. When students can recognize where in the work they need clarification and then seek out answers to help them get that clarity, they are laying a strong foundation of ownership of their learning.
few comments in the chat box about not being able to read the quotes. Yes, the video or the recording of this session will be made available on the YouTube channel, so you can go back to it and read it if you wish. So we began this session by talking about intrinsic motivation and how we can motivate our students by setting the goal for feedback together. When students are a part of the discussion and are provided feedback that is effective, based on their needs, timely, actionable, and ongoing, they embark on a learning path to fulfill their potential. They learn to communicate what works and does not work for them based on their learning style. They understand the fluidity of the feedback process and how to keep it moving along in a timely manner. These students recognise calls to action and take productive next steps. And finally, they realise that learning is ongoing, always looking for new things to learn. As teachers, we have committed ourselves to our students' learning, and we too are lifelong learners. Whether we are keeping up with technology, reading the latest research, or learning from our colleagues, there is always room to improve. Feedback is a task which we do so routinely that sometimes we need some fresh ideas to refocus our efforts. So, let's talk about some feedback strategies to incorporate into your instructional practice. First, remember that your feedback is aimed at improving students' learning and development as lifelong learners. Virtual students experience a personalised curriculum, and this personalisation needs to be interwoven into their feedback. Feedback needs to be focused and aligned to the assignment objectives while remaining detailed. There may be other areas to address, such as spelling, grammar, and punctuation, but keep your feedback focused on those objectives. Provide meaning comments where necessary, but avoid over-commenting. There will be a time and place to address all of those skills. However, your feedback should be aligned to the objectives and the skills that the students need and should be presented in a clear and easy to understand language. Another strategy is I noticed, and you can add it to your feedback methods. So this strategy is especially important because saying I noticed acknowledges the student's efforts. Acknowledging a student and the efforts he or she is making goes a long way to positively influence academic performance. Let's take a few moments to read over these examples and consider how your own I noticed feedback may look. I noticed you identified the relevant information and ignored the distracting ones. I noticed that you used a quote from the story to support your ideas about the theme. And I noticed you highlighted the 3 items in the prompt that you needed to complete. Hopefully these examples will give you some ideas as to how your own I noticed feedback can look. Another idea to add to your feedback bank is to ask students to give you feedback. Did you ever have the opportunity to provide a professor feedback at the end of a course? Did you find yourself being open and honest about what was boring, exciting, challenging, or irrelevant because it was anonymous and had no impact on your grade? When offering students the opportunity to provide you feedback, keep the following characteristics in mind. Keep it anonymous. The feedback is valuable, and you want students to feel completely comfortable being honest. Ask for feedback about specific things, such as what went well, what would they do differently, and what did they learn from you? Feedback will help you continue to grow as a teacher and offer powerful opportunities to reflect on your instructional practice. Finally, use guiding questions to ensure a consistent focus and quality control over your feedback. According to the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development, use these questions as a guide. Where is the student going? Feedback that answers this question describes what success would look like in the area in which the student is working. And what would it look like when he or she masters the current objective? And what would they do? What would they need to do in order to improve? How is the student going? Feedback that answers this question tells where the student is on the voyage of learning. What are the student's gaps, strengths, and current achievement? Where to next? This is particularly important. When we ask teachers to describe feedback, they typically reply that it's about constructive comments, criticisms, corrections, content, and elaboration. Students, however, value feedback that helps them know where they're supposed to go. Remember, it is critical that both teachers and students agree to the goal of feedback. These questions would be a great tool to create a rubric, or they can be a guide to your conversations with students. Use these questions to make sure you and your students remain in sync with each other and with the ultimate goal of the assignment. So today's session was a very quick but a fresh look on a familiar topic. While you routinely provide feedback to your students, consider how you can refresh your feedback to fuel your students' desire to become a lifelong learner. And as we wrap up today, make a note of a new strategy that you can implement to refresh your feedback. And implementing some of the strategies discussed today will only fuel your students' passion for learning. Now, that's enough talking from me. Let's take a quick quiz to consolidate our learning from today's session. Charlie, can you please launch the survey? Thank you very much. So we'll give you a few minutes to answer the questions on screen, and then we will reveal the correct answers or the results. Remember, there's 5 questions to answer, and then we'll show the results. Just a few more moments and then we'll show the results. Cool. Charlie, shall we show the results now, please? Perfect, thank you. So for question 1, it was you could choose as many as you wanted, and the majority of you chose that student learning is improved by feedback, yes, and the goal of feedback is to develop lifelong learners. So those are the correct answers. So thank you very much to everyone who chose those options. And students should be given a grade every time the teacher gives feedback. 29% of you were correct in that you don't need to give a grade every time the teacher gives feedback. Question 3. So how can teachers make feedback meaningful for students? And this again was a multiple choice. And the second and fourth answers, so setting mutually agreeable goals for feedback and discussing with students how a final grade was determined, were the correct answers. Question number 4. So using ICE notice statements acknowledges the student and the effort they have made with the task. And 31% of you ticked true, so that is correct. And then the last question, question 5. Which is a reason to ask your students to give you anonymous feedback? And the correct answer is the top one. So students can feel safe to share their honest feelings, which helps you grow as a teacher. Thank you, Charlie. Do we have any questions? Okay, so Gina, you might, can you come off mute and potentially help me, please? So we've got a few coming in. How can we make students understand that feedback is not a punishment, but the way to their improvement?
Great question. I think one of the things that we want to continue to think about is, and especially in an online environment, is how important building relationships will be with your students. I think you've all noticed, if you've been doing this for a while, it's very different when we walk in and read the room, right? In a face-to-face classroom, we start to really know where our kids are. Sometimes feedback can even just be a very simple expression or look. And online, it's got to be much more purposeful. And so building these relationships also takes this kind of purposeful time. And you've got to just commit to sort of carving that out. So having these conversations that we talked about, where you ask sort of what is their goal of the feedback, already empowers them to expect feedback and to say what they want from feedback and to say kind of how they want it. And just that conversation takes the rest of that sort of ominous punishment and sort of heavy-handed sort of teacher feedback that might make them feel uncomfortable or less than. It takes that away because it was their decision. So it's really a new world to be doing this virtually, and that is sort of the gist of this session, is to think about switching that up a little. And as we said, it's having those initial conversations. Now they're part of the story. They're part of the plan. They worked on this with you and they said, yeah, when you give me feedback, I want to know, what I can do, how I can get a better grade. That's often what they're going to say. So you have the opportunity to really talk to them about it and say, okay, this is also really about your effort. Now, would you like it if I circled these things for you, if I told you this? And now the punishment is gone because they decided with you.
Cool. Thanks, Gina.
Yes.
Talking about online feedback, how do you get online feedback anonymously?
Yeah, I saw that question. It's fantastic. And Stacey, I thought, you definitely have a lot of awareness of what types of documents. If you do, if you did some surveys, you could do that and get some short answers and make it anonymous so that they know. I mean, you genuinely have to set it up that way. And I think Microsoft Forms would probably let you do it. Google Forms would let you do it. If you did a shared doc with a table and fields to enter, or a shared Excel of any kind, I'm not sure if you can see who wrote it. I think you might be able to. That was my one concern about a shared document, but I think I would probably suggest therefore a survey, even SurveyMonkey. What do you think, Stacey?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So Microsoft Forms and Office Forms are fantastic tools in keeping things anonymous if you need to. And working obviously in a PD environment with Gina, we use surveys to gain feedback quite a lot. And the majority of the time, we don't ask for any identifying information. Going into the shared documents world, it can be a bit tricky depending on kind of your email servers that your students use. So if you're using Google Drive and some students are using a Gmail email address, sometimes it can pick up names if you're using a shared document, but most of the time it will just give them funny names of animals. So I've worked on documents with colleagues in the past, and I can see that Raccoon is editing in the document. It doesn't give me their name, but it gives me an indicator that someone else is working in the document. So just trial and error. Yeah. Microsoft Forms, Google Forms, shared docs, a way forward. And then some more. What about using peer feedback? What do you think to that, Gina?
Fantastic suggestion. Online, well, whether you're doing it face-to-face or online, peer feedback needs a lot of guidance. So you'll really need to set that up well and take the time to create a rubric and teach your students what you want them to do and how you want them to do it. It's a skill. It's a tough skill. And students, they will go with sort of what they've heard in the past, but you're carving a new world. So you really do need to share with them what you expect this feedback to be like. Actionable, what do you sort of the keys to your feedback, how do you teach them to do it? So that's the first thing I would say. And the second is that when you're doing this online, you're going to need to set up sort of a very intentional schedule for how you want them to do it. So it's hard enough for us to figure out sort of all of our online schedules, and we just need to make sure that we say, okay, along with how to give this feedback, here's a schedule for who's working with whom and when they're doing it. And I think once you set up something like that, I completely agree, it can sort of run itself. They can also do a lot of great online. If they're older students, they can be reviewing each other's products and then providing comments and have it all be electronic like that. The younger students, it's a little harder to do, but the older students, that's a great way to do it. But again, really teach them what you want in those comments. It's not just about fixing the spelling and fixing something sort of straightforward. It's really about setting the goal for the project and helping them give some productive feedback for how to get to those goals.
Cool. Yep, thank you. And how often do you recommend giving feedback?
Oh, that's another great question. I think that every project is going to be a little bit different. So that's why you want to stop and say, what is the goal for this project? What is the goal for what I'm having them do? And then pick a point, some type of formative assessment partway through where you are providing them intentional feedback. And if you just do it once during that project, that's amazing. But it really depends on the project. And if it's a longer, larger one, again, for the older students, then it's something that you can do maybe a couple times. But you're always giving feedback. Everything we're doing, every time we're connecting with our students, that is feedback. So I'd love to say do it all the time, but I think just realistically, plan for at least one sort of midpoint in a project when they're producing a product.
Cool. Thank you. And then I think this is the final question that we can have due to time. This might be a fairly techie question, which we might not be able to answer, but we can try and find an answer. So here we go. If my students are in an online class, say Microsoft Teams, how do they stay anonymous?
So same question that we had before, right? And this is about anonymous feedback. If you're asking them to give you feedback anonymously, if that's the question, then I think we'd have to go back to, using either counting on those character names that Google provides. As Stacey mentioned, you go in as like anonymous hippo and raccoon. It just provides a name for you. So test it out with your students and see if that's happening. The other would be the surveys. But if you're asking a different question, you want it to be anonymous for a different purpose. I'm not sure what that is. If you want to add that to the chat.
Mm-hmm. I think the question was around how, if you're on an online class, the students are anonymous. You can't see who is in the class and who isn't. I don't know if you could.
If my students are in online class in Teams, how do they stay anonymous? Yeah, I mean, I think if it's just for that one exercise of providing feedback, it would have to, it's that separate exercise. In general, they're not going to be anonymous. Just like in your class when you're face-to-face and you're asking for feedback, if it's in the class, you're obviously going to know who's providing it. Even if it's written, to be honest, it's pretty tricky in their handwriting when you get to know them. So you have to set up these kind of events for anonymous feedback. And I think even in face-to-face classrooms, I would probably want to do an online survey and send it home, have them do it from their devices.
Cool. Thanks, Gina. Okay. Yeah, we can hear you, Charlie.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks. Good. Sorry for that. You couldn't hear me earlier. Okay. Well, Gina and Stacey, another inspiring session there. So thank you so much for putting those together and for delivering it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Brilliant. And to all of you attendees, thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. Certificates will be sent out to you all. The recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel soon, and look out for the virtual goodie bag that will be sent to you all after the session. We hope to see you at more Pearson English webinars, and take care and stay safe until then. Thank you.